Earlier this week, the Union government notified India's next population census, which will include a caste census, the first time that caste based data will be collected since the 1931 census. This enumeration of castes will have momentous political consequences, and the fact that it's being conducted reveals a lot about India's political climate and how the state sees its obligations to its citizens. Throughout history, data collection has been the means by which rulers understood the people they governed. But the methods, depth, and objectives of censuses have evolved over the centuries, from alliance building under medieval kingdoms such as the Cholas, to balancing caste and economic dynamics under the Mughals, Rajputs, and Marathas, to racist ethnography and ideological control under the British Raj. The history of Indian caste censuses is, in many ways, the history of Indian statecraft. From the beginnings of Indian statecraft and the Arthashastra from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century CE, rulers and political theorists emphasized both revenues and caste order as important to an orderly kingdom. In Book 2, Chapter 35, the text authors laid out the duties of revenue officers who had to record cultivated lands, exemptions, and grants, and also to list households of the 4 social classes. Of course, the quality of such data couldn't be taken for granted, so secret agents were to verify all information. The state described in the Arthashastra derived revenue not just from industry and agriculture, but also from fines imposed on offenders. In Book 3, fines and punishments were listed according to caste, upholding the social hierarchy envisioned by Brahmanical texts. We have no idea to what extent early Indian states actually implemented the Arthashastra, but inscriptions from the early century CE suggest another reason why rulers might have wanted to keep an eye on castes. Groups such as bankers, merchants, weavers, scribes, and artisans of the Gangetic Plains were forming caste-like collectives and participating in city administration. As historian Chitrarekha Gupta writes in The Writers' Class of Ancient India, such collectives were a significant political and social force. Throughout the medieval period between roughly 600 and 1100 CE, they developed across the subcontinent. States had to deal with city assemblies, village assemblies, occupational assemblies, and caste assemblies, all with their own laws, traditions, and claims to rights. The Chola Empire, the most centralized early medieval state, ordered multiple land surveys to fix tax rates, but occasionally ran into headwinds from organized assemblies of cultivators and landowners. In the early 11th century, when the empire was on the ascendant, this wasn't too much of a problem. In fact, land surveys helped the Cholas build alliances with communities by ensuring that temple endowments were recorded and maintained. But by the late 11th century, as the tide of conquest slowed and the court weakened, inscriptions show that super assemblies like the Chitrameli Periyanaadu alliance, composed of cultivators, landlords, and Brahmins, began to make their own decisions on what revenues to pay the state. By the 1300s, such alliances were also asserting authority over social and political hierarchies and lobbying for rights and privileges. For any medieval Indian ruler, measuring land and monitoring caste were absolutely essential. While few revenue records survive from the early medieval period, the picture improves drastically from the 1500s as new gunpowder states like the Mughal Empire invested in larger bureaucracies. We have a pretty good picture of Mughal administration from the Ain-e-Akbari, the Institutions of Akbar, written by the Mughal courtier Abul Fazl. He recorded estimated revenues from districts, apparently based on measurements taken by local bureaucrats. Interestingly, he also paid attention to North India's many castes, making note of Thakurs, Rajputs, Jats, and other landowning communities. But while the Mughal bureaucracy produced mountains of statistics, the data quality was extremely dubious. In Rethinking the Economy of the Mughal Empire, historian Sumit Guha critically examined Mughal revenue documents. He found that assessed tax revenues were infrequently updated. After all, accurately estimating harvests would have required bureaucrats to revisit villages across seasons and years, which they didn't really have the resources or inclination for. Akbar's successor Jahangir cited the same revenue statistics in his memoirs as those in the Ain-e-Akbari, which were by then 20 to 30 years out of date. Mughal bureaucrats also fabricated revenue estimates for restive or unconquered provinces to make political claims. Where they did have control, they demanded extortionate shares of the harvest between a quarter and a third. In Beyond Caste, Identity and Power in South Asia, Guha also points out that some caste data were recorded at the village level so that revenue demands could be made on caste headmen. Unsurprisingly, village scribes often fudged numbers to avoid taxes. Local zamindars bribed officials, and officials fabricated data to seem competent. If caught by inspectors, brutal punishments were inflicted, but since Mughal officials didn't have accurate revenue estimates in the first place, they sometimes flogged or imprisoned scribes, collectors, and village heads who, for justifiable reasons, couldn't meet their expectations. Guha writes, and I quote, "Not only corrupt officials but also merchants, bankers, and indeed small farmers striving to avoid starvation had every incentive to conceal information. Data were generated out of a constant struggle between peasants, local chiefs, and officials. A torrent of unrecorded bribes and a wealth of recorded inaccurate statistics were the result." Corruption became embedded at every level of the state. European travelers frequently complained about the bribes demanded by Mughal officials. But there was something to be said about the underlying idea of detailed local data responsive to different communities and different conditions. To tackle this problem, Guha writes, when the Maratha king Shivaji defeated the Mughals and established rule in the Deccan from 1656 onwards, he reprimanded corrupt officers, appointed new village accountants, and ordered accurate revenue settlements. Other Indian states also sensed the need for better data. In census, human inventories in late pre-colonial and early colonial India, historian Norbert Peabody examined the Marwar Parganamni Vigat, a survey of the Marwar kingdom between 1658 to 1664 by Munhata Nancy, an Oswal merchant and minister to Maharaja Jashwant Singh Rathod. Nancy's survey, Khansumari, enumerated households by castes in every district capital. This perhaps was the first true caste census in India. Other kingdoms in Rajasthan conducted similar Khansumaris and village surveys called Yadastis, but the concept of aggregating rural and urban data did not develop. While Nancy privileged his own Oswal community in his listings, he otherwise acknowledged that each locality had its own unique caste hierarchies, and Nancy wasn't also overly preoccupied with religion. But that was soon to change. By the 18th century, Guha writes in Beyond Caste, many Indian states, especially in Maratha dominions, had developed fairly detailed caste enumerations by household used to regulate social hierarchies and impose differential taxation and privileges. Populations remained relatively mobile, responding to incentives offered by competing states. Into this bewilderingly complex system came the British, with their own mostly imagined ideas of how Indian society functioned, along with a hard-headed approach to revenue. The British were somewhat justifiably suspicious of locally reported data and sent salaried officials to conduct their own surveys. But unlike Indian states, the British counted individuals, not households. They also insisted on permanent addresses and borders because they were suspicious of migration. This devastated itinerant traders such as the Banjaras as well as pastoralist communities. But perhaps most damagingly, the British imposed their own categories and political needs on India's shifting mosaic of identities. In 1845 to 46, after battling insurgents from forest tribes, the Bombay government insisted on categorizing people by religion rather than caste and separately identifying wild tribes. After the 1857 rebellion, the British grew even more obsessed with religious categorization. Following Queen Victoria's proclamation that the Raj would not interfere with Indian customs, the British consulted upper caste Indian elites, primarily Brahmins, to define these customs. And the results were deeply skewed. As historian Nicholas Dirks notes in Castes of Mind, Colonialism and the Making of Modern India, H. Risley, who oversaw the 1901 Bengal census, relied extensively on scripture such as the Manusmriti, which most castes didn't actually follow. Risley also bought entirely into racial theories linking caste to Aryan descent and endorsed upper caste norms such as child marriage and the prohibition of widow remarriage that Hindu reformers were fighting against. He used this racially weaponized data to argue for the partition of Bengal and for separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims. Indian elites quickly adopted these British categories since they appeared scientific by the standards of the time. There was as yet a little understanding of how misshapen colonial theories about India were. Racial theories and binary religious identities, Hindu and Muslim, were absorbed wholesale. Caste organizations flourished, connected by railways and the telegraph. Hindu and Muslim elites found that they had a lot to gain from consolidating a once diverse kaleidoscope of caste groups along religious lines. The eventual demand for partition was the culmination of decades of identity formation built on data collected by a self-interested colonial empire. Since independence, generations of Indian statisticians and sociologists have drastically improved the quality of data collection, allowing for much more humane policies and planning. But history shows us that good data isn't guaranteed, nor are good intentions or good policy outcomes. Indian rulers have always recognized that data is power. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can follow me on Instagram at Anabuddha and on Twitter at Ekanisati. We'll see you next week.